Hello, everyone, and welcome to Merchant Fraud Journal's Alternative Payments Report webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We're going to give everyone a couple minutes just for some people that might sign on a couple minutes late, but we're here, very excited for the event. So just hang tight, about 2 more minutes, and then we'll get started. Okay, so welcome everyone from wherever you're listening. We're very excited to present this event. We really appreciate you taking the time to come out. It's going to be very insightful. We have some amazing guests and really looking forward to it. And without further ado, let's get started. So we wanted to start off by explaining who we are, where we're from, and why we're here. So our guests today are Jane Lee. She's a trust and safety architect at CNP Science. She specializes in spam, account content abuse, and payments risk. And prior to joining CNP, she was on fraud teams at Facebook and Square, and also spent some time as a private investigator, and is very passionate about designing and operationalizing systems for detection and enforcement of fraud at scale. Alexander Hall, on the right here, is an incredible wealth of knowledge and information. We interviewed him on our To Catch a Fraudster podcast. Highly recommend you check that out. He has 14 years of collective experience with fraud and fraud prevention. He's a reformed high-level fraudster and entered the ranks of fraud prevention in 2017. His fraud prevention strategies have been successfully applied to over 1 billion in merchant transactions, resulting in millions of dollars of mitigated losses. In 2020, Alexander founded Dispute Defense Consulting and now works with fraud prevention solution providers around the globe to challenge, refine, and expand their offerings. And his unique insight and articles have earned him the title of subject matter expert by Card Not Present, and was the foundation upon the newly developed Think Like a Fraudster virtual workshop course. And of course, I am Bradley Chalupski, editor-in-chief and co-founder at Merchant Fraud Journal, one of the leading e-commerce fraud publications, as you all know, and going to talk a little bit, just real quick, about us and who we are and what we do. So our publication was founded by myself and another fraud industry professional with a lot of experience in the industry. And our mission is to bring an independent and unbiased publication that's dedicated to empowering online sellers to greatly reduce the impact of e-commerce fraud on their business. This was something that we thought was really important as a communal resource, and we view ourselves as that, a place where the community can come together, and we publish insights from thought leaders and merchants across the entire spectrum about chargeback prevention, account takeover fraud, data breaches, basically anything that you can think of having to do with fraud, as we'll talk about today. And our audience, like you, includes senior level decision makers at enterprise companies, small business leaders, other industry experts, academics. I've spoken with everyone in between. And our content, you can check it out on our website. We have unique resources that we build through the community that we have. And for those of you that have participated in those surveys and in that research over the course of the year, we really appreciate and value your feedback because it meets our goal of pooling the knowledge. And that's where we really think we bring value to the marketplace, is being that independent voice that has a lot of trust with fraud prevention leaders, and so can bring these insights to market. And that's one of the reasons that today we wanted to talk about alternate payments. Alternate payments is a subject that we feel is not getting enough attention in the current landscape. Traditionally, fraud prevention has focused on chargebacks and credit card fraud prevention. And for the better part of a decade, that's been really the only place that you've needed to focus if you were looking to bring a fraud prevention strategy to market and be effective. But we've seen that that is changing with the years, and there are more and more alternative payment options that are available and that have to be available to customers who expect them. So we wanted to understand how merchants currently think about the role of alternative payments in their business. And we also wanted to ask how they are protecting against these payment methods when it comes to fraud, because this is a problem that is only going to continue to grow, and its nature requiring a fundamental shift in mindset and attention is an extremely delicate and difficult thing to do. So we wanted to get a better handle on this. And so we asked 3 questions. Do you plan to expand the number of payment methods you accept in the next 12 to 24 months? Which type of e-commerce payment fraud do you invest the most in preventing? And how effective are you at preventing e-commerce fraud from sources other than credit cards? And the results were absolutely shocking to us. For the first question, how do you plan to expand the number of payment methods you accept in the next 12 to 24 months? We found that a quarter of people said yes, a quarter of 6.7% said no, and 66% said that they were unsure. And what we took from this data, what surprised us is that nearly 95% of companies are at least thinking about expanding their acceptance of alternative payment methods. And this is a really important point for fraud prevention specialists to understand, because what that means is that if not offering them as an option, customer choice means that they're going to go elsewhere. And so you're going to be seeing this come down from above a lot more directives to expand the number of payments, and people are already hearing about it. So it's very few people that know for certain that this is not going to be relevant to them in the past. And I'm assuming that this number is going to continue to decrease very rapidly. So for the second question, we asked, which type of e-commerce fraud do you invest the most in preventing? Now, what was really, really shocking here is that despite 95% of merchants realizing that these new payment methods are becoming more and more important, increasing emphasis on them, that credit cards are still where people are focusing. We're still seeing investment in credit cards. One thing that kind of surprised us about this is that credit cards have been the focus for so long that we expected to see a much larger shift towards these alternative payment methods as they become more and more ubiquitous in the marketplace. And that's not what people are focusing on. And that is really, really problematic, and brings us to the last question, which is how effective are you at preventing e-commerce fraud from sources other than credit cards? And only a quarter of fraud prevention experts were able to say that they're very effective. And so what we're seeing here is a huge disconnect between what fraud prevention specialists know is going to be expected of them as business imperatives continue to evolve over the next few years, where they're focusing their efforts, which is still mostly on credit cards, and how effective they actually feel at being able to prevent alternative payment fraud. And so all 3 of these things in tandem paint a picture of unpreparedness. And the data is there showing us that this is something that needs to be addressed right now, and that in the future, preventing e-commerce fraud is not going to be just about chargebacks. The era of preventing chargebacks is over. That's just a fact. And merchants are being challenged on a number of fronts and need to make sure that fraud prevention specialists are deploying multiple strategies that are distinct, but yet also overlap to maximize the effectiveness of their protection and their ability also to prepare for the unknown, since these things are relatively new and we are all still learning. So this data was so shocking to us that we wanted to talk more about it. And that was where we invited Jane and Alexander to come. Guys, we're so happy to have you. Please, Jane, if you want to jump in and introduce yourself personally, we'd love to hear more about you, and then continue on with the presentation.
Yes, thank you so much, Bradley, for that lovely intro. And I just want to say hello to everyone before we begin. As mentioned, my name is Jane. I'm a trust and safety architect at SIFT. Basically, you could think of my team as the in-house consultants that interface with both internal as well as external folks to understand the state of fraud. And then, one of my passions is devising creative solutions to solving these really growing, evolving problems. I do want to dive into a few of the six of the fraudy payments that we just went over. But before we do, I want to pass it over to Alexander, who's on the call as well.
All right, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Bradley, for that amazing introduction. Yeah, and again, as he mentioned, I am a reformed high-level fraudster. I own Dispute Defense Consulting. I work with merchants and service providers, and I'm here to help essentially shed light on a lot of the high-level operations that I participated in my past. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and yeah. So Jane, if you want to take it back, I'll follow your lead.
Yeah. So, I think Bradley, Alexander, and I, when we met, we were equally shocked about credit cards being, the payment method that merchants were most interested in or investing the most in preventing. Again, there is that discrepancy between the 66, 67% of folks that were still unsure of whether they wanted to accept alternate forms of payment. And of course, we are here to talk about alternative forms of payment. This study actually correlates with a SIFT study that we did with internal customer data. Credit cards were definitely up there. Gift cards, I was shocked to see based on the MFJ results. Gift cards, that's kind of a tale as old as time, right? When someone asked me to talk about the top fraudiest payments, one of the first methods that came to mind to me were gift cards. The anonymity, the liquidity of gift cards, of course, makes it attractive for bad actors. You gain a stolen credit card, convert that to a gift card. Now that value is on a gift card. And by the time the cardholder finds out, fraudster has done and gone away with the gift card. The other thing worth mentioning is in-app purchases. In-app purchases internally at SIFT, we've seen a huge increase in. And this, of course, I think gaming industry is a good example of what's going on there. A lot of gaming platforms offer platform credits that you could then buy, that you could then use to buy. And the main way that we are seeing in-app purchases being exploited are through, of course, account takeovers, ATOs being the conduit to this type of fraud. Alexander, do you have anything you wanted to add to this list?
100%. Yeah. So to further reinforce the whole concept of this, it goes along with this idea, this article that I wrote, that's fraud is more than fraud. The generally accepted concept behind fraud is that it's all centered around stolen credit cards that are exchanged in this e-commerce down in the dark web. And granted, yes, there's a high volume of that. I'm here to, shed light on the fact that, I would say 80% of the methods that I participated in had nothing to do with stolen credit cards. There's different methods to come across credit card numbers. Checks were highly valuable. I was surprised to see in this report that 0% was invested across all of the participants of this poll towards checks, because checks to a fraudster, as far as creating a check, the difference between a simple piece of paper and a check is a Micker line, magnetic ink. That's a $40 purchase. Compare that to the hardware and resources that you need in order to create a credit card, and you're looking at a $200 embosser, you're looking at a $200 reader writer, you're looking at a $100 tipper, and plus you're looking at track information and a lot of knowledge. So in order to exploit checks, it's a lot easier than it is to exploit credit cards. And that's coming from the perspective of a fraudster. So it's just surprising to see that 0% related to checks. Now, in regards to gift cards, there's multiple ways to exploit gift cards. One method was involved with going into the store and grabbing a stack of gift cards off the rack, going home and taking all the information underneath the scratch off and making a list of it, putting those cards back onto the rack and allowing them to be purchased during holiday time, checking the numbers that you have at home. And because of the terms and conditions that are printed on the cards, there's no refunds. Just like Jane said, it's anonymous, right? It's free flowing, and there's no accountability for bad transactions, right? You can't report a chargeback on a gift card. So that's one thing that fraudsters definitely understand. And then to further reinforce the ATO concept, there's several methods, and there's a spectrum of ATOs. A fraudster doesn't need full access to an account. They don't need to hijack an entire bank account in order to build a profile and gain value out of a debit, credit, or checking account. One example that I'll pull up is in the past, a very limited amount of information was needed in order to access the transaction history on a bank account. So by using the card number, the CVV number, and just the billing zip, which are fairly easy to come across for a fraudster with people in the right places, you can gain access to the transaction history. So then what they do is they'll set up a secondary app that they can connect to the bank account and start to mimic good transactions from the transaction history. After verifying the micro deposits, let me throw that in there, sorry, they can begin to replicate minor deposit amounts or transfer amounts that mimic good transactions in the account and slowly drain the account over time. So when we consider ATOs, it's important to understand there's a wide spectrum of that. Credit cards we're all familiar with, and there's a lot of different ways to come across the information. I wrote an article called Math as a Payment Method, wherein it's possible to literally generate credit card numbers by reverse engineering Loon's algorithm, or the modulus 10, the mod 10. With crypto, there's a huge liability with the way that the crypto gets exchanged, and it's not just important to save the skin of the merchant. I'm sure Jane's going to get into this. It's not just important for the merchant to save their skin, but it's also, there's an ethics thing that goes into it as well. Yeah, so for this slide, those are just some examples of things that I bring to light. And whenever you're approaching fraud prevention, there's another article that I wrote called Fraud is More Than Fraud, wherein I talk about all of the ways that fraudsters operate. And it's important for merchants to understand all of the various ways that fraud can get into your system. And that's where my strategy development process comes into play. So
Personally,
yeah.
I was extremely well versed in Loon's algorithm before I met Alex, but I'm sure other people out there aren't.
I have to admit, I was not, a lot of I can't tell you how much I learned just from my, 2 or 3 interactions that I've had with the both of you. Just all of the things that I thought I knew about fraud were speculation, and I can't, just chatting with both of you, I've learned so much more. One thing, Alexander, that you just mentioned about crypto that I wanted to add on to, someone in another event, asked me, they were like, hey, crypto is actually the safest payment method for merchants to accept because there are no chargebacks. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. Yes, from a financial perspective, yes, that might be true. But Alexander, you mentioned like the ethics of it. How, do you want to be responsible for money laundering? Sure, from a financial perspective, you might not see the chargeback losses, but that responsibility does, I feel very strongly, does fall on the merchant to make sure that the money that you are accepting has not been stolen, that hasn't been that hasn't originated from a bad place.
Yeah, and I want to jump in there because we did an episode of the To Catch a Fraudster podcast where we spoke about the connection between fraudulent e-commerce and human trafficking, and how the money can be traced back, and how these groups go into e-commerce fraud in addition to other horrific, awful things that they're doing that are even worse than stealing money from people, quite frankly. And so it behooves the entire fraud prevention community to really take the ethics of these things seriously. And from a business perspective as well, if it came to light that some ring was using crypto and they had frequented your store, made a lot of purchases, or somehow it was traced back to you, the idea that you would be able to plead ignorance in the court of public opinion is simply not true. That's just not how it works. And so it's not only the right thing to do morally, but it's also a business imperative. And it really does show just how chargeback focused the industry continues to be. And we continue to be as a fraud prevention community. And it's really important. And the reason we wanted to hold this webinar is to start that discussion of breaking out of that mindset and realizing, yes, chargebacks are still a thing. They're still painful. They are definitely difficult to deal with, but this is becoming such a broader ecosystem. And Jane, this is why we wanted to bring you in, because we know that this is something that at SIFT, you guys are on the bleeding edge on right now, talking about this new ecosystem that really goes beyond just the one-to-one chargeback versus fraud prevention specialist match that we've all been in for 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you, I think if you jump up 2 or 3 slides, we at SIFT like to talk about this as the fraud economy. Bradley, you mentioned, the days of just preventing chargebacks are over. It's not just the chargeback front that merchants should be worried about. So when we talk about the fraud economy, the best way, I guess the TLDR way to think of it is it's a very sophisticated network of cyber criminals that are coordinated and have the methods, have the strategies in place to extract value from businesses. As someone with a heavy economics background, it operates just as traditional economies. You have skilled labor, you have different types of labors. It follows the laws of supply and demand. Prices depend on supply and demand. And there are marketplaces in which illegitimate information is bought and sold, oftentimes, actually most of the times, using cryptocurrencies. And so the scope of trust and safety teams has increased dramatically. If you go over to the next slide, you see all of these peripheral problems that all contribute to this inner circle where you see the content abuse, account takeover, and payment fraud. We're not just looking at payment fraud. These are all connected. There are, this is just a limited view, but there are hundreds of vectors that bad actors can leverage to exploit your systems. We talk about this one-to-one approach. I'm trying to coin the term one-dimensional fraud. It hasn't really stuck yet, but one-dimensional fraud is easy to catch. It's easy to detect whether, a credit card was stolen, right? You get that response back relatively quickly from your payments processor. But now when an account is taken over to use a stored payment method, that now becomes a little trickier to catch. If you move over to the next slide, I know we're here to talk about payment fraud. So let's dive into some of the vectors contributing to what we thought of as a simple payment fraud problem. Some things that I want to call out here: BOPIS and refund abuse. These, according to SIFT data, we have seen on the rise due to the pandemic. With BOPIS, I think the reason why we've seen such a spike there is because a lot of omni-channel or just retail merchants have been forced to shift to an online presence, especially due to the pandemic. Many of them were not ready to do that. By ready, I mean didn't have the fraud checks in place, didn't have the right systems in place to be able to detect this. Alexander, do you have anything specifically to say about maybe BOPIS or refund abuse here?
Sure. And to further reinforce exactly what you were saying about how the landscape changed in 2020, COVID, BOPIS being a new avenue for everyone to go down, almost mandated in order for them to survive in business. The thing is, fraudsters, when they find that a company has made the jump from strictly in-person to e-commerce, whether that's through a payment portal or using a third-party app online or using a proprietary system online, whatever the system is, when a when a company makes that shift from in-store primarily to online as well, you get so I'm going to paint this picture here. So below BOPUS, you see card testing. Now, when a company makes that move, typically they have the lowest requirements mandated because they're not expanding deep into the realm. They just want to get what they need, and they start there. That's the baseline model that they're after. Well, that's where card testing comes into place. So now imagine that a company who just made that jump now gets hit with 50 orders of a fraudster going through their method development process in order to find out what works. So now, when I was authoring new methods, I would put through 10, 20, 30 different orders with completely irrelevant information, with absolutely no hope of any of them actually making it to me. Because, of course, years into the operation, you have mountains of information. Well, in order to find out what checklist of information works at different establishments, different websites, you put through several orders. Every single one of those could result in a chargeback, or every single one of them is expected to result in a chargeback. Then when it's time to actually execute one for in-store pickup or whatever it may be, that's when BOPUS comes into play. Now, going another route, you have the refund abuse. This is something that kind of falls in line with the... Oh, do you want to answer that?
Oh yeah, sorry. I think we just got a question. Sorry, we should have clarified this earlier. By BOPUS, we mean buy online, pick up in store.
Yeah.
Meaning people can purchase things on the internet, but don't get them delivered to their home or to a PO box or wherever. They go to the store to pick it up.
Curbside pickup is a great example.
Right. Yeah, and that was a big deal. That was a big exploit that fraudsters were already exploiting before, because they can assign a secondary alternative pickup to go into the store with a fake ID and pick it up. So that was already a vulnerable system to begin with. And then now that everybody across the nation and the world adopted this new practice, just opened them up even more. So yeah, Jane, back to you.
Absolutely. And thanks for shedding light into that. Bradley, if we move over to the next slide. So we talk about the most prevalent type of fraud. I think this is what most respondents were thinking of when they were talking about preventing credit card payments. This is our classic, what we know as CNP fraud. Unsurprisingly, this has increased in 2020 with the pandemic, again, forcing merchants to ramp up their online presence. Bad actors are constantly testing your system. I saw this all the time, especially at Facebook. My work focused on malicious URLs. You can't imagine how many phishing attempts or phishing links are shared across the platform. And I think Facebook does a pretty good job at preventing those. But yeah, and this is the most prevalent type of fraud. The screenshot you're seeing over on the right is a bad actor. We took this from a Telegram forum that we sort of lurk, but basically sharing a list of I guess skimmed credit cards that are actually in a physical card format that he's then selling off for a much lower price. And I think Alexander mentioned math as a payment method. This is how you see that manifesting. Oh, sorry, did you have something to add there?
No, but I did see a question that came in about Loon's algorithm that I wanted to just put some clarity to. So I don't believe there's any exceptions to this, but it's not, Loon's algorithm is not something that is elective to the merchant. Loon's algorithm is the universal algorithm that's applied to all credit cards. Again, I don't know if there's any exceptions, but I've never ran into any. So if you consider the 16 or 15 digit card number that's on any credit or debit card, the first 6 is going to be your BIN number, and then the remaining numbers all fit into an algorithm. And the way that fraudsters manipulate this is by taking call it a root credit card number. So a valid credit card number that's either been burnt out or maybe is a legitimate card number in their pocket, who knows? But you lop off the last 4 digits and then you generate numbers. Now for the last 4 digits, you would assume that there's 9,999 valid possibilities. But because of Loon's algorithm, it's not that much. It's between like 1,500 and 2,500 that are valid card numbers. And then following that, when you have a list of valid card numbers based on your root card number, then you hijack a merchant account number, like through authorize.net or something like that, and you call in authorizations for dollar amounts. Once you get to a section of the list that has authorized for dollar amounts, meaning they're linked to active accounts, that's when you can go and attempt purchases with companies who have low requirements. So the way that this affects merchants is typically through telephone orders and mail orders, and then other proprietary systems that have very low requirements where the information can get typed in manually, or don't require CVV, or don't validate the billing address, or don't validate the IP address and stuff like that. Just the card number and expiration date is what you get with generated card numbers. So the industries that are heavily affected by that are going to be food and beverage, hotels, rental car companies, things like that seem to trend in that direction to be highly susceptible to that method.
I love your story, Alex, when you said you saw a card in an advertisement, either on television or in a magazine, and you contacted the company to say, hey, you know, you put your card up for people to see, and they wrote back basically saying, what are you, dumb? That's a dummy card. No one can use it.
Right. That's what they said. And I said, right. But fraudsters can use the thousands of other cards that are related to it. Right.
One of my top 10 stories for sure. What are you, stupid? This is a dummy card. Everybody knows that. We wouldn't put a real card on here. Just face
yeah, to their credit, not to the credit card companies, but these are incredibly smart, sophisticated fraudsters. I think that's a point that a lot of people find shocking. But anyways, can we move on to the next slide? I think we just got in a question, and I hope this next slide addresses it. But the question was, could you share a little bit more on dark web data purchase, and if there's any effective way to prevent that from conducting fraudulent behavior? Dark web data purchases, basically what happens is, I guess to explain dark web, a simple way is to talk about recent data breaches, right? And so I'm going to pick on a recent one that was in the news recently. T-Mobile had a massive data breach. What happens after these data breaches is they then end up on the dark web. And so after that news was announced, I actually did go in and look into one of the dark web marketplaces that we actually do also lurk in, and found over 1 million T-Mobile accounts for sale. And that happened right after that breach. So to give you an idea of like the supply chain, I guess you can say, it goes from breach to dark web and then to sale. What happens after the dark web? Bad actors are known to buy batches of these accounts. And then to further complicate the problem, when you consider the fact that over 65% of online users recycle their platforms, someone that is using their T-Mobile login on their Facebook account, now 2 accounts are hacked. It's not just one. I think we already talked about card testing, so no need to go further into that. But if you go over to the next slide, you'll see the types of information. This is a screenshot that I grabbed from one of the dark web marketplaces that we look into, but this is PayPal, another business that has had a pretty newsworthy data breach in the past years. And if you can see in the middle column saying credit card, the types of information that is sold can get quite invasive. And all the way on the right, I think it got a little cut off, but these all go for a price. And so I think the ones that you're seeing here on the screen, just because they have all the way on the left-hand side of the column, a 0 PayPal balance, they are going for relatively cheap. All the way on the right side, you see a little over $1, but another account that I come across a lot is Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo accounts, if you have $20,000 cash sitting on the account, those can go for like $200 a pop. If you go over to the next slide, another big marketplace, you can say, or an exchange marketplace for bad actors to buy, sell, exchange information is Telegram. So this is from Telegram. It's a few forums that we do track. And what you're seeing in one of the middle screenshots here, you have, again, very, very invasive PII, personally identifiable information being sold, from social security number to date of birth. And of course, that's all used to develop synthetic identities that then can be used to, again, extract things like social security benefits, tax benefits, unemployment benefits. Alexander actually had a really interesting comment he made about this, about SSN DOB. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that, Alexander.
Sure. Yeah, actually the third screenshot, the third column there is a screenshot of SSNDOB's information. Back during bad operations, SSNDOB was something that could be used in order to link an incomplete profile. So I think on this side of the fence, on the good guys side, it's called synthetic IDs, but on the fraudster side of things, they're called profiles, stuff like that. And it's how you develop a spider web of information centered around a certain identity, whatever identity you're trying to attack. So SSNDOB was a platform that was heavily leveraged, and one method that was used was, so say someone has an ID that works for them, the similar face that they can use, and it's John Smith, right? So John Smith doesn't have the John Smith of the ID might not have a great credit report, or might not have a high credit score, but if you were to go to SSNDOB and type in John Smith there and go down a list, you could associate another John Smith's social security number and date of birth and relevant information to the ID that the fraudster has control of. And then after that, you can further flesh out the profile by three methods that I'm trying to bring to the table for all of us on this side, which are account reassignment, credit hijacking, and credit injection. And those, the shorthand version of those three methods are by reassigning accounts that you already have access to then include the John Smith with the social security number that the fraudster is trying to relate. You can then put that information together into the credit report. Then secondarily, by establishing a prepaid card or maybe a secured card somewhere with low requirements, you can then start establishing credit in that name with an address that the fraudster dictates, and the cell phone number that the fraudster dictates. Then following that, the last step would be to hijack the credit, which would be to lock it down with something like LifeLock. So the fraudster is effectively locking the real person out of their own identity, their own credit identity, while they go ahead and get credit lines and establish it and run it down to zero. Now, that sounds like a lot of work, and that's what I've been told when I explain this, but consider that all it takes is one file cabinet from one leasing office in order to have access to hundreds of profiles. Out of these hundreds of profiles, you might pick out 5 or 6 that are worth, at the end of the day, might be worth $60,000 to $70,000 worth of credit. You run 5 or 6 of them over the span of 6 months, and you just made $300,000. So to a fraudster, that's the type of volume and value that they're pulling out of synthetic IDs or profiles, and then settings like this, SSNDOB, and these fulls and these profiles and stuff like that. So that's how that fits into the equation.
Thanks. And, I have to say, I'm learning the lingo. When you say pros, when I look through these forums, I'm not sure of what certain things mean. They definitely they have their jargon that they use. So now I know pros is for profiles.
I can clarify one more if you guys don't know it. Up here on the fourth column.
Oh yeah,
says
sure.
101, 201, 221, 220, 606.
Uh-huh.
Those are card codes. So that's going to be relevant to the track data. So 101s, it's been 5 or 6 years now, but I think 101s were for EMV chips. 201s are the track data. 221s are global. 220s are the NFC chips, and then the 606 I'm not familiar with, but that's how you water down to see which ones are going to be track writable, which ones are chip writable, and other ones.
Oh yeah. See, and every conversation that I've had with Alexander, I learned something new. One other thing that I did want to add, when you were talking about IP vulnerability, something else I come across here are files of IP addresses where they're like, hey, this merchant, you can use this set of IP addresses to circumvent their systems, and they work. And so, yeah, a lot of juicy information being exchanged in these forums. If you hop over to the next slide, Bradley. So again, we touched about, we touched on this a few slides ago, but what do bad actors do after they obtain funds, right? Of course, you want to extract value as quick as possible. You want something that has liquidity, right? And that's where cryptocurrencies, they are liquefied. Is liquefiable the right word? Meaning you can cash out, you can obtain the actual value relatively quickly. It's transferable. It can transfer across borders. And of course, the anonymity, which we already talked about. And money laundering, that's something that we're seeing prevalent, especially in our marketplaces, as well as in fintech, right? Where you kind of have a two-sided marketplace, a buyer and a recipient, in which case both of them can be fraudulent and using both accounts to launder money that has been obtained in an illegitimate way. Wow, big words there. Alexander or Bradley, do you have anything else to add to this?
I thought that was a pretty good explanation, Alex.
Yeah, perfect. I just want to further reinforce it by saying that I just recently signed up for crypto.com and was surprised at how easy the system was, and it actually caught my attention because it was so easy. Now I had to present an ID, I had to present my personal information, but back a few years back when I was making different different crypto wallets, the process was a lot more involved. So I was just surprised to see how easy it was. Now maybe they have a lot of verifications running on the back end, and now that I'm a good guy, my information is more reliable out in the world on the back end of these systems. But yeah, it was just surprising to see how easy it was to make a crypto wallet nowadays. So yeah, that was shocking to me.
Thanks. So we just spent a lot of time talking about a lot of bad things. So I think it's important to for our audience to walk away with actionable things that we can do. And so if we go over to the next slide, I know Alex has talked about his 4-step process. Alexander, do you want to elaborate a little more on this?
Sure. So anytime that I work with a merchant, I essentially develop for them a blueprint following a pretty robust strategy session. So it's a 4-step process. The first step is to identify all of your transfers of value. Now that's a term that I'm trying to bring to the market because it's important to understand that fraudsters are not, as we've been saying throughout this whole thing, fraudsters are not limited to cash, check, card, right? For example, we've been talking about credit lines, or I've talked about credit lines. We've talking about gift cards. We're talking about checks. We're talking about everything. So as long as you have an idea of where fraudsters see value in your operations, you're then going to be able to take the part B in identify, and that's going to be to conceptualize your associated baseline processes for fraud prevention, right? So once you've done those 2 parts of step 1, then you move on to monitor. You monitor this performance. You're going to see you're going to start to identify bad trends. You're going to identify what bad characteristics there are, certain shipping addresses, certain billing addresses, IP addresses that might be used multiple times in your system, things like that. And you're going to be able to see where the volume is. Once you discern where the volume is, that's where it's going to be appropriate to move on to step 3, which is to automate by employing one of these great service providers such as Sift. And in order to automate high volume things, so you're not but so that you're not dedicating so much time and effort to manually process these things, you're going to automate it, and with expected results, by tapping into a robust a robust network of data sources and stuff like that. And then as your company grows, you're going to repeat this process. As you start to offer proprietary gift cards, in-house credit applications or credit lines, as you start to sell more products in different places, you're going to be susceptible to new vulnerabilities. So then you just start back at square one, and it's a completely cyclic thing that goes on and on until the end of your business. So that's my strategy development process in a box.
Yeah, and if you move over, yeah, thanks, Bradley. And just reiterating what Alexander just said, when we say automate at SIFT, we love automation, but you could think of it as automation times 60 billion, which is the number of transactions we evaluate on a monthly basis. And I think it's actually a little over that. But SIFT is a machine learning platform. And so what we do is we take not every single bit, but all of this passive information that you're obtaining about your customer, about the device they're using, about their identity, behavior, feeding it into our patented machine learning algorithms, and then feeding back our merchants a score depending on how risky we determined it to be. If you move over to the next slide, an example of this is email analysis. We do deep signal analysis. Here you can see Blue Sky Jumper at yotmail.com. Traditional rules-based systems perhaps you would just block yotmail.com or flag those for review or block the email address. But what happens when this bad actor starts, the next iteration of this is Green Sky Jumper or Yellow Sky Jumper. And so it's important to do that pattern matching between different email addresses. Of course, we're evaluating whether something's a disposable email, the characters, the consonant to vowel ratio, really deep, complex things that the naked average human eye cannot do at scale. If you move over to the next slide, please. And so we just talked about deep signal analysis on emails, but as you can see here, we're not just doing it on email alone. We're doing it on the device. We're doing it on social data that we have. We're doing it on IP address analysis, velocity thresholds. We actually evaluate over 16,000 features at SIFT. The good news is a lot of this is passive data that you're already collecting about people that are visiting your platform. And again, what we do is we do this pattern analysis to then provide our merchants the best SIFT score that we think or the SIFT score that we attribute to it, so that they can decide how they want to automate on that. If you move over to the next slide, the one thing I must say about having relying on machine learning is the global data network that we do have. Here you see a list of a handful of SIFT customers, and the advantage of working with high volumes of data from a global network is if a bad actor comes to Twitter and tries to exploit Twitter, I can guarantee that they will then try hitting Facebook, that they will then try hitting Airbnb. It's not limited to one merchant. One type of fraud is not limited to one type of merchant. A good example of this actually, I would say, is with romance scams. I was talking to a friend over at who used to be at Nextdoor, but we were basically seeing very, what we thought were the same cluster of bad actors deploying different types of romance scams. Romance scams started off as the Nigerian prince scam and now has evolved to something else. But you can guarantee if someone at Twitter said, hey, this has been confirmed to be fraud, our customers in the rest of our network will take advantage of that, or will receive advantages or benefits from that, I should say. Anything else you want to add to this, Bradley or Alexander?
So I think the core takeaway from this, to sum up, is that the traditional way, as we said, of thinking about fraud in e-commerce was just through the lens of chargebacks. And what we're seeing now is that that's not the case. And hearing from Alex, I agree with you, Jane. Every time I talk to Alex, I'm blown away by the knowledge that he has and the way that he can fill in the gaps and the blind spots, as he puts it, in everybody's collective vision of what's actually possible right now. And with all these alternative payment methods that are increasingly used and increasingly important to consumers, fraudsters are going to find the loopholes, find the ways to exploit these new methods that we as a fraud prevention community are not currently prepared for. And that's okay because they're new and that's understandable. And in a certain sense, it's always harder to play defense than it is to play offense. But from my perspective, from what we're seeing as a publication, talking to the community at large, is this problem is just not being addressed enough. It's business as usual, focus on chargebacks. Sure, there's crypto. Sure, there's all this other in-app, Twitch, all these types of things. But we're just going to remain myopic and focused on what we've always done and what we already know. And that's increasingly going to simply be untenable as a community. And what we were trying to do, and thank you, Jane, and thank you, Alex, for coming on at our invitation and explaining this more, is to sound that alarm that this is here. Alternate payments is here. Winter is not coming, it's here. And we just want to make sure that we're leading that discussion and trying to put it on people's radars as we move forward.
Absolutely. And, thank you so much for having us. I look forward to doing more of these with both of you very soon. I do think we got some really interesting questions from our audience, some around the dark web that I'd like to tackle. So I'm going to merge these two questions that were asked. One was the name of the dark web marketplace. The one that I showed screenshots from is called Slilp. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but it's SLILPP. That is just one of many that we look into and one of many that exist. The reason why we like this one in particular is because they focus on verified accounts. So they offer a sort of guarantee. Surprisingly, there's an ethics code amongst bad actors too. So if you buy an account that doesn't end up working, they have a refunding process for that. The other question that we were asked was, how do you access the dark web? Is it a portal or a web link? So these are only available via Onion Link. So you cannot access them using your normal browser. You need to have special browser configurations. I would say take the extra step of anonymizing your location as well. But yeah, they're not accessible just via, Google search.
We've been getting a lot of questions also if the slide deck will be shared. And yes, we'll make sure in the coming days to send out a recording, send out the deck. And we've also put together a report that will largely summarize what you've heard here as well, if you want to have a quick reference. We also had an interesting question, Alex, about synthetic IDs. And if you're referring to manufactured IDs, but not real IDs, and I think you'll have a lot to say on that. So I'll kick it over to you because you've done this, so you'll be able to speak to it a lot better than I will.
Well, maybe, because I'm still trying to get familiar with the terms as it is on the fraudster side versus the fraud fighter side. So the way that I understand it, and Jane, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that synthetic IDs are it's not a manufactured identity. When we say ID, it's not, the physical ID that you're holding up. That would just be a counterfeit ID. But when we say synthetic IDs, I believe it's a profile that's been created on the internet with associated information. So of course, for that information to be valid, it has to be real information, at least to some point. Now, the way that synthetic ID is then manipulated is by employing the methods that I was outlining before, the account reassignment, the credit injection, and the credit hijacking. If that is how fraud fighters define synthetic ID, then that's on the fraudster side, that's called building profiles and stuff like that.
Yeah, just to, you had it right. So I've heard it called several things, stolen slash synthetic identity. Third party fraud is another term that I've heard used, but essentially this is, you can think of it as, so say you're doing your traditional KYC checks, right? That are validating, hey, is this the person's name, date of birth? Is it their, you match up those pieces of information. Those will check out. They check out because they were used from a stolen identity. And so there was a pretty notable case, I think back in 2015, where I think it was a hospital had a bunch of children's information that was stolen. And these eventually showed up on a dark web marketplace, but it was basically like, hey, here are a bunch of names, social security numbers that work, do what you may with them, go take out loans, do whatever. One thing I forgot to talk about recently when we were talking about those Telegram screenshots and the SSN DOB method that you talked about, for our American audience or our US audience, Bank of America actually a couple months ago made headlines for disabling a bunch of accounts that were supposed to receive their unemployment benefits or their unemployment. I believe they were coming in the form of a debit card. And of course, like Bank of America didn't go into the details, but I highly suspect it was because they were unable to distinguish which were actual people that needed to receive their unemployment benefits, or distinguish those from the fraudsters, essentially.
Wow.
All right. If anyone has any other questions, we're already have 4 minutes left. So thank you, everyone, for your attention and participation. This has been really wonderful. It's been our pleasure to host you guys, and we would definitely love to take you up on doing more of these in the future. If you guys have any last words before we sign off.
Yeah, I guess one thing I just completely forgot to follow up on, I think someone asked, so what can we do? How can we protect ourselves from things that are on the dark web? How do businesses and consumers protect themselves, from their information coming up on the dark web? Sadly, you can't, right? Because this is stuff that has been obtained illegitimately from wherever. You can't control that. But what we do advocate for businesses is to be proactive. Oftentimes these bad actors, they will slip. There is a PC or a MacBook somewhere at the root of this where they're conducting all of this, and that is where you can be proactive. Hey, if you found that this device was used to conduct a fraud somewhere else in the network, great. When that shows up at your front door, be able to recognize and enforce accordingly. So it's just to be proactive against this very complex, evolved fraud economy.
All right, Alex, any last
Yeah, I'd
words
like
of
to
advice?
answer the question from Nick Carenza. What can we do to be the best possible custodians of data on websites that can be used to fill in fulls and profiles? Are you talking about, if you're talking about securing your own database, that's going to be cybersecurity stuff and all that. But I want to just give some insight regarding how to process fulls and profiles. When profiles are being built out and fleshed out and manipulated, and this applies for anyone who deals with credit, account situations, identity information across the board. When these tactics are being employed, one way to identify that is to watch for what I call non-unilateral changes. So when people reassign accounts, they're typically prepaid cell phone accounts. When people establish new credit cards, they're typically prepaid cards and low requirement secure cards. If you see those things pop up recently in one of these applications related to this identity that's putting in an application for your line of credit, watch for those recent flags that popped up in order to maybe treat that as a flag that this identity has been hijacked. that's the clear, I mean, if I were still operating, that's one thing that would definitely disrupt this process. Consider yourself. If you've had cell phone service for 10 years with a certain carrier, how likely would it be that you would change your billing address or add a new billing address, add a new cell phone, add a new secured, line over here, and then go out for a $20,000 card? It's just not a likely chain of events. So the fact that you brought up fulls and profiles, I really wanted to touch on that and make sure that as you receive this information, you had a way to disrupt the method that I mentioned earlier.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone for attending. We'll send out the recording and the deck and the report in the coming days. And make sure to check out SIFT. Make sure to check out Dispute Defense Consulting, wealth of information and fraud prevention there. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. See you next time.